The dust rose like a golden veil as Abigail Harrington stepped off the stagecoach, her gloved hands trembling not from the arduous 3-day journey, but from the fear that someone might notice what lay beneath the long sleeves of her traveling dress. Sunrise Creek appeared just as her late aunt's letter had described a small but growing settlement in Montana Territory. 1876, with a single dusty main street flanked by wooden structures fighting against the elements and time itself. "Welcome to Sunrise Creek, madam," the driver said, tipping his hat as he handed down her single trunk. "Town ain't much, but the people are decent enough." Abigail nodded, tightening the shawl around her shoulders despite the summer heat. "Thank you. Could you direct me to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house? End of the street, blue building with white trim. Can't miss it." Abigail gathered her skirts, careful to keep her arms close to her body. 6 weeks had passed since she'd fled Boston, since she'd escaped him. Yet the marks remained fading yellow bruises and thin scars that told the story she desperately wanted to forget. The weight of stares followed her down the street. A new face always drew attention in small towns, especially a woman traveling alone. Abigail kept her eyes forward, focusing on the blue building in the distance. This would be her fresh start, far from the refined drawing rooms of Boston where her husband's charming smile had hidden a monster's soul. "Look out, miss." The warning came a moment before a horse thundered past, narrowly missing her. Startled, Abigail stumbled backward, losing her grip on her trunk. It crashed to the ground, springing open and spilling her belongings onto the dusty street. "Whoa, Ranger," a deep voice commanded, and the horse that had nearly trampled her circled back, its rider dismounting in one fluid motion. "I apologize, madam. My horse got spooked by that backfiring wagon." The man knelt to help gather her scattered belongings. Abigail hurried to collect her things, panic rising as she realized her spare chemise had fallen out, the sleeves too short to hide what her traveling dress concealed. "Please, I can manage," she insisted, reaching for a book that had landed near his boots. The man, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-weathered skin, looked up at her, his eyes a startling blue beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. As he handed her the book, his gaze caught on her wrist where her glove had slipped, revealing mottled skin in shades of fading purple and yellow. Instinctively, Abigail yanked her arm back, tugging her glove into place. "Thank you for your assistance," she said stiffly, willing him to leave. Instead, he finished helping her refill the trunk, his movements efficient and careful. When he closed the lid and secured the latch, he straightened to his full height. "Name's Preston Sullivan. Most folks call me Prees." He tipped his hat. "I'd be happy to carry this to wherever you're headed." "That's not necessary." "Maybe not, but it's the proper thing to do after nearly running you down." His tone was gentle but left little room for argument. Abigail hesitated, calculating her options. The boarding house was still some distance away, and the trunk was heavy. "Very well, Mr. Sullivan. I'm headed to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house." "Good woman, Mrs. Holloway, makes the best biscuits west of the Mississippi." He hefted the trunk with ease. "You're new to Sunrise Creek, I take it?" "Yes, I'm visiting my late aunt's property." The lie came easily, practiced over miles of travel. "Abigail Harrington," she added, realizing she hadn't introduced herself. They walked in silence for a moment, Abigail keeping a careful distance between them. Preston Sullivan was clearly a working man, a cowboy by the look of him, with his worn leather chaps and the dust that seemed permanently embedded in the creases of his tanned face. Yet there was something in his manner that spoke of a deeper intelligence than his rough exterior suggested. "What brings a Boston lady all the way to Montana Territory?" he asked casually. Abigail stiffened. "How did you know I'm from Boston?" He gave a small smile. "Your trunk has a Boston Leather Works mark, and your accent, though you try to hide it, has that distinctive Eastern cadence." You're quite observant, Mr. Sullivan. Need to be in my line of work. Cattle don't tell you when they're fixing to bolt. They reached the boarding house, a neat two-story structure with window boxes full of hardy wildflowers. Preston set her trunk on the porch and tipped his hat again. If you need anything while you're in Sunrise Creek, I'm usually at the Sullivan Ranch about 3 miles north, or you can leave word at Sawyer's General Store. He paused, his expression turning serious. Montana can be harsh, Mrs. Harrington, but most of us out here believe in giving folks privacy about their pasts. Before she could respond, he was back on his horse, a cloud of dust the only evidence of his presence as he rode away. Mrs. Holloway proved to be a plump, efficient woman in her 50s who asked few questions and showed Abigail to a clean, simple room on the second floor. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," she said. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. Hot water costs extra on days other than Saturday." Alone at last, Abigail sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion washing over her. She rolled up her sleeve, examining the marks that had drawn Preston Sullivan's attention. They would fade eventually, but the memories wouldn't. Charles Blackwood, her husband of 2 years, had made sure of that. She hadn't planned to run until that final night when the beating had been so severe she feared for her life. With the help of her lady's maid and a sympathetic lawyer, she'd filed for divorce in absentia, a scandalous move that would have ruined her in Boston society if she'd stayed. The lawyer had arranged to have her aunt's modest inheritance, previously controlled by Charles, transferred to an account in her maiden name. Freedom had cost her everything she knew, but as Abigail looked out the window at the vast Montana sky, she wondered if perhaps it had given her something greater in return. The next morning, Abigail rose early, dressing carefully in a high-necked blouse and full skirt, her arms safely concealed despite the warmth of the day. Mrs. Holloway had informed her that Mr. Jenkins, the town lawyer who held her aunt's paperwork, wouldn't be available until the afternoon, so she decided to explore the town. Sunrise Creek was smaller than she'd imagined, consisting of one main street and a few side roads lined with a mix of businesses and homes. The general store, a saloon, a small bank, a schoolhouse, and a church formed the heart of the community. Beyond the buildings, the land stretched out in every direction, rolling hills dotted with sage and pine, leading to distant mountains that seemed painted against the impossibly blue sky. Abigail entered Sawyer's General Store, a bell announcing her arrival. The interior was dim after the bright sunshine, shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, fabrics to ammunition. "Good morning," greeted a middle-aged man from behind the counter. "Welcome to Sunrise Creek. I'm Thomas Sawyer, proprietor. Good morning. I'm Abigail Harrington." "Ah, Mrs. Holloway mentioned we had a new guest in town. What can I help you with today?" Abigail browsed the shelves, selecting a few necessities: writing paper, ink, and a small bottle of rosewater. As Mr. Sawyer wrapped her purchases, the bell over the door jingled again. "Morning, please," Mr. Sawyer called out. "Got that order of fence wire you've been waiting on?" Abigail tensed at the name, turning slightly to see Preston Sullivan removing his hat as he entered. He nodded politely when he saw her. "Mrs. Harrington, I trust you settled in well." "Yes, thank you, Mr. Sullivan." She paid for her items quickly, eager to leave before further conversation could develop. "Actually," Preston said, stepping closer, "I was hoping to catch you. There's a matter concerning your aunt's property that might interest you." Abigail froze. "You knew my aunt, Martha Jenkins. Everyone in the county knew her, fine woman, tough as nails." His eyes held a question she couldn't quite decipher. "I've been managing her cattle since she took ill last winter." The name was wrong. Her aunt had been Elizabeth Harrington, but Abigail maintained her composure. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. My aunt was Elizabeth Harrington. Preston's brow furrowed. Miss Elizabeth from back east bought the old Miller place about 5 years back. Yes, that's right, Abigail said, relief flooding through her. Well, I'll be. Didn't realize she had family. He studied her for a moment. That property's been sitting empty since she passed. It's about 4 miles out of town, not the easiest place for a woman alone. I'm quite capable, Mr. Sullivan, Abigail replied stiffly. Never suggested otherwise. But that roof needed work even before Miss Elizabeth died, and there's been no one tending the garden or livestock. Livestock. This was news to Abigail. The lawyer's letter had mentioned a cottage and some land, but nothing about animals. Just a few chickens, a milk cow, and a horse if they are still alive. Neighbors have been looking in, but... He shrugged. Would you like me to show you the place this afternoon? I'm heading that direction anyway. Abigail hesitated. The thought of being alone with this man she barely knew made her nervous, but the practical side of her recognized the value of his knowledge. I have an appointment with Mr. Jenkins at 2 o'clock. I can meet you after, say 4 o'clock. I'll bring a wagon. That trunk of yours won't fit on horseback. Before she could formulate a reason to decline, Mr. Sawyer chimed in. You'd be wise to take him up on it, Mrs. Harrington. Prees knows that property better than anyone, and he's the most honest man in the county. Put on the spot, Abigail nodded reluctantly. Very well. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. After leaving the store, Abigail continued her exploration of the town, finding herself drawn to the small church at the end of the street. It was a simple white building with a modest steeple, the door standing open in welcome. Inside, sunlight streamed through clear glass windows, illuminating rough-hewn pews and a plain wooden altar. Hello, Abigail called softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. A door at the side opened and a gray-haired man in a black suit emerged. Good morning, I'm Reverend Graham. Welcome to our humble church. Abigail Harrington, she introduced herself. I arrived yesterday. To see about Elizabeth's place. At her surprised look, he smiled. News travels quickly in small towns, Mrs. Harrington. Elizabeth was a valued member of our congregation, though she kept mostly to herself. I didn't know her well, Abigail admitted. She left Boston before I was born. The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. She mentioned family back east, though she rarely spoke of them. Said there'd been some disagreement with her brother, your father, I presume? Yes, they had different views on many things. This, at least, was true from what little Abigail knew of her estranged aunt. Well, she found peace here, I believe. A quiet life suited her. He paused, his kind eyes studying her face. If you're planning to stay, you're welcome to join us for services on Sunday. Thank you, Reverend. I haven't decided how long I'll remain. As Abigail turned to leave, he added gently, Our church is always open to those seeking sanctuary, Mrs. Harrington, for whatever reason. The knowing look in his eyes made Abigail wonder just how much her face revealed about her circumstances. She nodded stiffly and hurried out into the sunshine, unsettled by the encounter. Her meeting with Mr. Jenkins proved informative. Her aunt had indeed left her a modest property, 20 acres with a small cottage, a barn, and grazing rights on adjacent government land. There were no debts against it, and the taxes were paid through the end of the year. Your aunt was quite specific that the property should go to you directly, not to your husband, Mr. Jenkins explained, peering at her over wire-rimmed spectacles. Quite unusual for a woman to specify such terms. My aunt was an unusual woman, Abigail replied neutrally, grateful for her aunt's foresight. It had created a loophole that Charles couldn't touch, a property he didn't know existed in her name alone. The deed is in order. You're free to take possession immediately. He handed her a key and a hand-drawn map. It's not much, but the land is good and the water rights are secure. By 4 o'clock, Abigail was waiting outside the boarding house with her trunk, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation churning in her stomach. True to his word, Preston Sullivan arrived in a wagon drawn by two sturdy horses. "Ready to see your inheritance?" he asked, jumping down to help with her trunk. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, accepting his assistance onto the wagon seat while being careful to keep her arms covered. They traveled in silence for a time, the wagon bumping along the rutted dirt road that led out of town. Fields gave way to scattered pine trees and the terrain grew more rugged. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Harrington?" Preston finally broke the silence. Abigail tensed. "You may ask. I don't promise to answer." "Fair enough." He kept his eyes on the road. "Are you running from someone?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. "What makes you think that?" "Most women don't travel alone to remote territories unless they're fleeing something or someone." He glanced at her briefly. "And most don't flinch when a man raises his hand to adjust his hat." Heat flooded Abigail's face. Had she been so transparent? "My personal affairs are not your concern, Mr. Sullivan." "No, they're not," he agreed. "But if trouble follows you here, it becomes everyone's concern in a town this size." "No one followed me," she said firmly. "And I have no intention of bringing trouble to Sunrise Creek." Preston nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Good to know. For what it's worth, folks around here mind their own business mostly. Fresh starts aren't uncommon in these parts." The road dipped into a small valley, and suddenly, Abigail caught sight of a cottage nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. A small stream ran nearby, and wildflowers dotted the surrounding meadow. "There it is," Preston said. "Your aunt's place your place now, I suppose." The cottage was smaller than Abigail had imagined, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, and behind it stood a weathered barn and chicken coop. It looked tired but solid, like it had weathered many seasons and stood ready for more. As the wagon pulled up to the front of the cottage, Abigail noticed signs of recent care. The path had been cleared, and there were fresh-cut wildflowers in a jar on the porch. "Mrs. Holloway came out yesterday when she heard you'd arrived," Preston explained, following her gaze. "Wanted to make it welcoming." The gesture brought unexpected tears to Abigail's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. In Boston, such kindness would have come with expectations of reciprocity and social obligation. Here, it seemed offered freely. Preston helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk onto the porch while she unlocked the door. The interior was dim and smelled of dust and dried herbs. Simple furniture: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a sideboard with blue and white dishes filled the main room. A curtained doorway presumably led to a bedroom, and a ladder against the wall suggested a loft above. "It's cozy," Abigail said, unable to hide her dismay at the rustic conditions. Preston chuckled. "It's a far cry from Boston, I imagine. But it's sound, and the roof only leaks in one spot when it rains hard." He set her trunk down. "There's a root cellar out back with some preserved goods, and the garden, though overgrown, has some vegetables ready for picking." Abigail moved to the window, pushing aside faded curtains to look out at what was now her land. The reality of her situation hit her fully. She was alone in a wilderness with no servants, no neighbors within shouting distance, and only the most basic skills for survival. "I don't know the first thing about gardens or livestock," she admitted, her voice small. "I figured as much." Preston's tone held no judgment. "Tell you what, I'll come by tomorrow morning and show you the basics, get you acquainted with the cow and chickens at least." "Why would you do that?" Abigail turned to face him, suspicious of his offer. "Your aunt was good to me when I first came to these parts. I was just a kid, barely 18, looking for work. She hired me to help with spring planting when no one else would take a chance on a scrawny Easterner who'd never seen the business end of a plow." His expression softened at the memory. "I owe her, And besides, neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we all survive." Something in his straightforward manner eased Abigail's wariness. "Thank you. I would appreciate the assistance. I'll bring some supplies, flour, coffee, the essentials. We can settle accounts later." As he turned to leave, Abigail called after him, "Mr. Sullivan, is there a lock on this door?" He paused, understanding darkening his eyes. "Yes, madam. A good strong one, and I'll bring a bar for the back door tomorrow." He touched the brim of his hat. "Sleep well, Mrs. Harrington. You're safe here." After he left, Abigail stood in the center of the cottage, listening to the unfamiliar sounds: birds calling, wind in the pines, the distant babbling of the stream. No carriages on cobblestones, no vendors calling their wares, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just nature's voice, constant and soothing. She explored her new home, finding the bedroom small but neat, with a quilt-covered bed and a simple washstand. The loft above held storage trunks of linens and winter clothing, jars of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a collection of books that surprised her with their variety. Her aunt, it seemed, had been well read despite her isolation. As darkness fell, Abigail lit the oil lamps she found and made a simple meal from the supplies in the root cellar: dried beans soaked in water and heated with preserved tomatoes, eaten with a slightly stale loaf of bread Mrs. Holloway had thoughtfully left. It was plain fare but satisfying in its simplicity. Later, as she readied for bed in the quiet darkness, Abigail rolled up her sleeves to wash, examining her arms in the lamplight. The bruises were fading to yellow, and the thin scars from the time Charles had thrown her against the china cabinet were beginning to silver with age, physical reminders of a life she'd left behind. She thought of Preston Sullivan's offer of help and his perceptive observations. In Boston, she'd become adept at hiding her husband's abuse, wearing high-necked dresses and long sleeves even in summer, making excuses for missed social engagements when the bruises were too obvious to conceal. Charles had been careful, too, never marking her face, always ensuring his violence could be covered by proper attire. Yet this rough cowboy had seen through her disguise immediately, recognizing not just the marks but the fear that accompanied them. Strangely, his knowledge didn't frighten her as much as it should. There was something steadying about his presence, like the solid ground beneath her feet after months at sea. Abigail extinguished the lamp and climbed into the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of her new home. For the first time since fleeing Boston, she slept without dreaming of pursuit. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the windows and the distant sound of a wagon approaching. Abigail dressed quickly in her simplest dress, braiding her hair in a practical style rather than the elaborate arrangements she'd worn in Boston. As promised, Preston Sullivan arrived with supplies and knowledge to share. The day passed in a whirlwind of practical lessons. He showed her how to milk the cow, a gentle Jersey named Buttercup, and collect eggs from the suspicious chickens. He taught her how to operate the pump for water and which vegetables in the overgrown garden were ready for harvesting. By midday, Abigail's hands were dirty, her back ached, and she'd learned more practical skills than in 26 years of genteel living. "You're a quick study, Mrs. Harrington," Preston commented as they sat on the porch steps, eating a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples he'd brought. "Necessity is a powerful motivator," she replied, surprised to find herself smiling. "Though I suspect the cow was laughing at my first attempts. Buttercup's a patient teacher. She's broken in many a novice." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment before Preston spoke again. "I've been thinking about your situation. This place is a good distance from town, and winter comes early in these parts. You might consider hiring help, at least until you're more settled." "I can't afford to hire someone," Abigail admitted. Her funds were limited, carefully hidden away from Charles over months of planning. Preston nodded thoughtfully. There's a young widow in town, Amy Wilkins, with 2 small children. She takes in washing, but she could use extra work. Perhaps an arrangement could be made her help in exchange for goods from your garden and milk from Buttercup. The suggestion made sense, and Abigail found herself warming to the idea of female companionship. I'd like to meet her. I'll let her know next time I'm in town. He stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. Now, about that garden. The afternoon continued with Preston showing her how to tend the vegetables and which wild plants near the cottage were useful for medicine or seasoning. He fixed the leaky spot in the roof, repaired the chicken coop, and showed her how to operate the small cook stove. As the sun began to set, he loaded the empty flour sacks and tools into his wagon. I'll stop by in a few days to check on you if that's all right. Sooner, if you need anything, just hang a red cloth on that pine tree by the road and I'll see it from my regular route. Thank you for everything today. Abigail hesitated, unused to accepting help without suspicion. I appreciate your kindness. It's not kindness, Mrs. Harrington. It's just being a good neighbor. He tipped his hat and climbed into the wagon. As Abigail watched him drive away, she felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. The day had been exhausting but satisfying in a way she hadn't experienced before. There was something honest about physical work that left no room for pretense or social maneuvering. That night, after a simple supper of fresh eggs and vegetables from her garden Abigail sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, a blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. She found one of her aunt's journals in a drawer and began to read by lamplight, discovering a woman she'd never had the chance to know, independent, thoughtful, and surprisingly content with her solitary life. I have found more peace in the song of wind through pine needles than in all the conversations of my youth, her aunt had written. Perhaps that makes me strange in the eyes of those I left behind, but I would not trade this hard-won freedom for all the comforts of civilization. Abigail closed the journal, pondering her aunt's words. Freedom. It was what she herself had sought in fleeing Charles, but she'd imagined it differently. Perhaps a quiet life in a small eastern town, teaching music or taking in sewing. Never this wild place with its vast skies and daily demands. Yet there was an appealing directness to life here, where one's worth was measured in practical skills rather than social graces. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Each morning, Abigail rose at dawn to tend to the animals, gradually growing more confident in her abilities. She worked in the garden, putting into practice what Preston had taught her, and consulting her aunt's notes when uncertain. The physical labor was exhausting but brought with it a dreamless sleep she hadn't known in years. True to his word, Preston stopped by every few days, always bringing something useful: nails for a loose floorboard, seeds for fall planting, a book of local flora he thought might interest her. He never stayed long and never entered the cottage unless specifically invited, respecting her space and privacy in a way that gradually eased her wariness. A week after her arrival, Abigail ventured into town to attend Sunday services, driven by both a desire for human connection and a need to establish herself as a respectable member of the community. She wore her second-best dress, high-necked and long-sleeved despite the summer heat, her hair arranged simply beneath a modest bonnet. The small church was nearly full when she arrived, conversations quieting as heads turned to observe the newcomer. Reverend Graham greeted her warmly at the door, and Mrs. Holloway waved her over to an empty space on her pew. "You're looking well," the boarding house keeper whispered. "Country air agrees with you." Throughout the service, Abigail was aware of curious glances, but they seemed born of natural interest rather than judgment. When the final hymn ended, Several women approached to introduce themselves, including Amy Wilkins, the young widow Preston had mentioned. "Mr. Sullivan said you might need some help out at your place," Amy said, a toddler clinging to her skirts while an older boy stood shyly behind her. "I'd be grateful for the work if you're still interested." Abigail arranged for Amy to visit the cottage the following day, then found herself drawn into conversation with other townspeople: Mr. Sawyer from the general store, Mrs. Peterson, who ran the small hotel, Dr. Mitchell and his wife, and several ranchers' families who lived in the surrounding area. Preston arrived late, slipping quietly into a back pew just as the service was ending. When the congregation filed out, Abigail noticed several people stopping to speak with him, the interactions marked by easy familiarity and respect. He caught her watching and nodded in acknowledgement, but made no move to approach her in the crowd. Later, as she prepared to return to the cottage with a few supplies from the general store, she found him waiting beside his wagon. "Thought you might appreciate a ride back," he offered. "It's a long walk with those packages." "Thank you," Abigail accepted, allowing him to help her into the wagon. As they drove out of town, she found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw shadowed with stubble, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the quiet confidence in his posture. "Everyone seems to know you well," she observed. "Been here 15 years now. That makes me practically a native in these parts." There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Started as a ranch hand, saved enough to buy my own spread eventually. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." "Your family must be proud." Something flickered across his face, a shadow quickly hidden. "Don't have much family to speak of. Parents died when I was young, raised by an uncle who wasn't particularly interested in the job." The simple statement revealed volumes, and Abigail felt a surprising kinship with this man whose experiences seemed so different from her own. "I'm sorry. Ancient history now." He changed the subject smoothly. "Mrs. Wilkins tells me you've arranged for her help. She's a good woman, hard-working." "Yes, we've settled on 3 days a week to start. I'll need to learn how to preserve the garden harvest for winter, and she knows the methods." The conversation turned to practical matters for the remainder of the journey. When they reached her cottage, Preston helped unload her packages, but declined her invitation to stay for coffee. "Got cattle to check before dark," he explained, "but I brought something for you." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought it might be useful." Inside, Abigail found a slim book titled "Practical Medicine for Frontier Households" and a small bottle of liniment. She looked up questioningly. "For your arms," he said quietly. "That liniment's good for old injuries. Helps with the aching when the weather changes." Abigail's fingers tightened around the bottle, a complex mixture of emotions rising within her embarrassment that her secret was so easily read, gratitude for his thoughtfulness, and something deeper she wasn't ready to examine. "I've noticed you still favor your right arm sometimes," he continued, his voice matter of fact. "Dr. Mitchell makes that liniment himself. Works wonders for my shoulder where a Mustang threw me against a fence post years back." His casual tone, treating her hidden injuries as nothing shameful, just another hurt that needed tending, loosened something tight in Abigail's chest. "Thank you," she managed. Preston nodded once, then turned to leave. "I'll be by on Wednesday to help with that broken fence section." "Those chickens of yours are determined to explore the whole territory." That night, alone in her cottage, Abigail applied the liniment to the lingering soreness in her shoulder, a reminder of the time Charles had twisted her arm behind her back, when she'd received a letter he didn't approve of. The ointment smelled of camphor and herbs, warming her skin with a pleasant tingling. As she rubbed it in, she allowed herself to remember Preston's words, his matter-of-fact acceptance of her wounded past. The days grew shorter as August faded into September, and Abigail found herself settling into the rhythms of her new life. Amy Wilkins proved to be not just helpful but companionable, teaching Abigail how to can vegetables and fruits, make soap, and prepare for the coming winter. The widow's children, 6-year-old Thomas and 3-year-old Sarah, brought unexpected joy with their curiosity and resilience. Preston's visits continued, always with some practical purpose, fixing something, delivering supplies, or teaching her a new skill. Gradually, these visits extended to include staying for a meal or lingering for conversation as the evening shadows lengthened. Abigail found herself looking forward to these times, appreciating his straightforward manner and unexpected flashes of humor. One crisp October afternoon, as they worked together harvesting the last of the season's apples, Abigail realized she was comfortable in Preston's presence in a way she'd never been with any man, not even Charles, during their courtship. There was no need to maintain a careful facade, to monitor her every word and expression for fear of provoking anger. "Penny for your thoughts," Preston said, reaching to pluck an apple beyond her grasp. Abigail smiled up at him. "I was just thinking how different life is here. In Boston, I never would have imagined myself climbing trees to pick apples. And I never would have imagined a Boston lady taking to frontier life so naturally." He handed her the apple. "You've changed since you arrived." "Have I? You don't flinch anymore when I reach past you. You laugh more easily. And you've stopped hiding your arms quite so carefully." Abigail glanced down, realizing she'd rolled her sleeves up to the elbows in the warmth of the afternoon sun. The marks were still visible, some would always be, but they'd faded to the point where they weren't immediately noticeable. "I suppose I have changed," she acknowledged. "This place, it allows for a certain freedom." "Freedom suits you, Abigail Harrington." The use of her first name, spoken with such quiet sincerity, sent a warm flush across her cheeks. In that moment, balanced on a ladder beneath an apple tree with the autumn sun painting everything in golden light, Abigail recognized the feeling unfurling in her chest. Attraction, yes, but something more profound. Trust. A sensation so foreign she'd almost failed to identify it. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Preston tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol he wore at his hip, a gesture Abigail had noticed before, but never seen him complete. A rider appeared around the bend in the road, and Preston relaxed when he recognized Thomas Sawyer's son. "Mr. Sullivan, Pa sent me to find you. There's a telegram waiting at the store marked urgent." Preston frowned. "Be right there, Billy." He turned to Abigail. "I should see to this." "Will you be all right finishing up here?" "Of course. Go ahead." She watched him ride away with the boy, a vague uneasiness settling over her. In her experience, urgent messages rarely brought good news. The following day passed without word from Preston, and by evening, Abigail found herself watching the road with growing concern. It wasn't like him to stay away without sending word, especially when they'd been in the middle of harvesting. Just as she was preparing for bed, a knock came at the door. Cautiously, Abigail approached, oil lamp in hand. "Who is it?" "Preston Sullivan." She opened the door to find him standing on her porch, his expression grave. "I apologize for the late hour, but I needed to speak with you." "Is everything all right?" He removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "May I come in? This isn't a conversation for doorways." Alarmed now, Abigail ushered him into the main room. He declined her offer of coffee, remaining standing as she took a seat in the rocking chair. "The telegram was from a private detective in Boston," he said without preamble. "Hired by me 3 weeks ago to make inquiries about a Charles Blackwood." The name hit Abigail like a physical blow. You've been investigating my husband, ex-husband, according to my information. The divorce was granted in your absence last month." Abigail gripped the arms of the chair, her mind reeling. How did you know about Charles? I never mentioned him or my marriage. You didn't have to. Preston's voice was gentle but firm. The marks on your arms told part of the story. Your reaction to men, your wariness, the way you protected your space told more. And your wedding ring finger shows the mark of a band recently removed. She unconsciously touched the pale indentation on her finger, a ghostly reminder of her marriage. Why would you hire a detective? Because when a woman travels alone to a remote territory with fear in her eyes and healing bruises on her arms, there's usually a man who believes he owns her not far behind. Preston met her gaze directly. I needed to know what kind of danger might be coming to our town to you. The practical explanation made sense, but Abigail sensed there was more. And what did your detective discover, Charles Blackwood, prominent Boston businessman and socialite? Widowed once before you, his first wife died under circumstances that raised questions but were never investigated thoroughly. Known for his charitable contributions and impeccable public image. Privately. Preston's jaw tightened. Privately, a different story emerged from servants and neighbors willing to speak confidentially. A man with a vicious temper and a talent for ensuring his violence left no visible evidence. Abigail closed her eyes, the familiar shame washing over her. You must think me such a fool for marrying him. No. The vehemence in Preston's voice made her look up. I think you were a woman caught in a trap designed by a predator who knew exactly how to present himself to the world. My detective spoke with your lady's maid Martha. She described how he isolated you, how his cruelty escalated gradually, how he threatened your family if you tried to leave. Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes, unexpected relief flooding through her at being truly understood. Why are you telling me this now? Has something happened? Preston knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to eye level. Charles Blackwood left Boston 3 days ago after making inquiries about Elizabeth Harrington's property in Montana Territory. He's coming here, Abigail. Fear, cold and familiar, spread through her veins. He found me. Not yet. But he's looking, and it won't take much asking around in a town this size to lead him to you. Preston's expression hardened. I won't let him hurt you again. You don't understand. Charles is powerful, connected. He'll bring the law on his side, claim I'm his runaway wife, mentally unstable perhaps. The scenarios she'd imagined during her escape played through her mind. The divorce is legal. You're a free woman, Abigail, with property in your own name. He has no claim on you anymore. Legal documents haven't stopped men like Charles before. She rose, pacing the small room. I need to leave to go somewhere else before he arrives. Running isn't the answer, Preston said firmly. This is your home now. You've built a life here, connections with people who care about you. If you run, you'll never stop looking over your shoulder. Abigail turned to face him, something in his steady presence calming her racing thoughts. What alternative is there? Face him. With the community behind you. Preston stood. Sunrise Creek takes care of its own, and like it or not, you're one of us now. Why would anyone stand with me against a man they've never met? I'm still a stranger here. Are you? He smiled slightly. Mrs. Holloway considers you the daughter she never had. Amy's children adore you. Reverend Graham speaks highly of your contributions to the church. Dr. Mitchell values the medicinal herbs you've shared from your garden. You've become part of this place, Abigail, in ways you may not even realize. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, but doubt lingered. And you? Why would you stand against a man like Charles? Risk your reputation and safety for someone you barely know? Preston's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. I think you know why. The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Abigail wasn't ready to acknowledge. Instead, she focused on practicalities. When will he arrive? The stagecoach comes day after tomorrow. We have time to prepare. They spent the next hour formulating a plan. Preston would alert key people in town, the sheriff, Reverend Graham, Dr. Mitchell, without revealing the full details of Abigail's situation. She would continue her normal routines, refusing to hide away in fear. And when Charles arrived, they would meet him together in public with witnesses present. As Preston prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Bar this behind me and keep your shotgun loaded. I don't expect trouble before the stage arrives, but better safe than sorry." "I will." He hesitated, then reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement to touch her cheek gently. "You're stronger than you know, Abigail Harrington. Don't forget that." The touch, brief and respectful, sent warmth spreading through her. "Thank you, Preston, for everything." After he left, Abigail secured the door as promised and leaned against it, her mind a tumult of emotions. Fear of facing Charles again warred with a growing determination not to let him drive her from the home she'd created. And beneath it all, Preston's words echoed. "I think you know why." Did she? The connection between them had grown steadily over the months, evolving from neighborly assistance to something deeper. She'd caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart beat faster, and she'd found herself thinking of him in quiet moments, imagining conversations they might have. But after Charles, Abigail had sworn never to give a man power over her again, and love, with its vulnerability and trust, was the greatest power of all. The next day dawned clear and cool, autumn asserting itself in the golden light and crisp air. Abigail rose early, determined to maintain her normal routine despite the anxiety gnawing at her. She milked Buttercup, collected eggs, and harvested the last of the season's squash, finding comfort in the familiar tasks. Amy arrived mid-morning with her children, unaware of the impending confrontation. They worked together preserving apples, the kitchen filling with the sweet scent of cinnamon and cloves. Thomas and Sarah played nearby, their childish laughter a counterpoint to Abigail's tense thoughts. "You seem troubled today," Amy observed as they sealed the last jar. "Is everything all right?" Abigail hesitated, then decided that Amy deserved honesty. "My former husband is coming to Sunrise Creek. He arrives tomorrow." Amy's hand stilled. "Former. I didn't realize you were widowed." "Divorced," Abigail corrected quietly. "Recently." Understanding dawned in Amy's eyes. She glanced meaningfully at Abigail's arms where the sleeves had been rolled up in the warm kitchen. "I see. It wasn't a good marriage. Few women seek divorce without profound cause." Amy's voice held no judgment. "Will his arrival cause problems for you? Possibly. Preston, Mr. Sullivan believes he's coming to find me." A small smile touched Amy's lips at Abigail's slip with Preston's name. "Mr. Sullivan is a good man to have on your side. The whole town respects him." "Yes, he's been very kind." Abigail busied herself wiping down the table. "Kind isn't the word most would use." Amy's tone turned thoughtful. "Mr. Sullivan keeps to himself mostly, has for years, but he's been at your place more in the past months than he's been in town the last 5 years." "People have noticed." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's simply been helping me adjust to country life. MMM." Amy's noncommittal sound conveyed gentle disbelief. "Well, whatever his reasons, you couldn't ask for a better ally, and you have others, myself included." The simple offer of support brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "Thank you, Amy. That means more than you know." After Amy and the children left, Abigail spent the afternoon restlessly checking and rechecking the cottage, ensuring everything was in its place. As the sun began to set, she saw dust on the road, a rider approaching. For a moment, panic flared until she recognized Preston's familiar silhouette. He dismounted in the yard, looking weary but determined. Sheriff Jenkins knows to expect trouble on tomorrow's stage. Reverend Graham and Dr. Mitchell as well. No details, just that a man from your past may cause problems. "Thank you." Abigail invited him in, pouring coffee as he settled at the kitchen table. "What do you think he'll do when he finds me?" "Hard to say. Men like that, men who control through fear, they don't handle losing that control well." Preston accepted the coffee gratefully. "But he'll be in unfamiliar territory, outnumbered with no influence here. His usual tactics won't work." They discussed logistics for the following day. Preston would meet her in town before the stage arrived, and they would face Charles together at the station with Sheriff Jenkins nearby. As they talked, Abigail found her fear gradually being replaced by a cold anger. Charles had taken so much from her already. She refused to let him take this new life as well. As evening deepened, Preston reluctantly prepared to leave. "I'd stay on your porch tonight if it wouldn't cause talk," he admitted. "I don't like leaving you alone knowing what's coming." "I'll be fine," Abigail assured him, though her heart warmed at his protectiveness. "The doors are solid and I know how to use the shotgun." He nodded, accepting her capability. At the door, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember you're not alone anymore. You have people who," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "people who care about what happens to you." The deliberate understatement brought a small smile to Abigail's lips. "People like you, especially people like me." His eyes, blue and steady in the lamplight, held hers for a long moment. Then, with a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Abigail with the lingering warmth of unspoken feelings. The night passed slowly, sleep coming in fitful bursts between periods of anxious wakefulness. By dawn, Abigail had abandoned any pretense of rest and rose to prepare for the confrontation ahead. She dressed with deliberate care in her best day dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror was not the frightened creature who had fled Boston. She stood straighter, her gaze direct, her hands steady. The stagecoach was due at noon. At 11, Abigail hitched her aunt's horse to the small buggy Preston had taught her to drive and set off for town. The familiar landscape passed in a blur as her mind rehearsed what she might say to Charles, how she would stand her ground against the man who had once seemed to control her very breath. Preston was waiting outside Sawyer's General Store when she arrived, his expression lightening at the sight of her. He helped her down from the buggy, his hands strong and steady on her waist. "You look ready for battle," he observed with approval. "In a way, I suppose I am." They walked together toward the stage-coach station, drawing curious glances from townspeople who weren't accustomed to seeing the reclusive rancher and the newcomer together in such formal circumstances. Sheriff Jenkins nodded to them from his position near the station, his presence casual but alert. The distant rumble of the approaching stage sent Abigail's heart racing. Preston must have sensed her tension, for he moved slightly closer, his arm brushing hers in silent support. "Remember," he murmured, "you're not the same woman he knew. You're stronger now." The stagecoach rolled into town in a cloud of dust, the driver calling for the horses to halt in front of the station. Passengers began disembarking: a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, a young man who looked to be a clerk of some kind. And then, stepping down with the same elegant precision she remembered, was Charles. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in an austere way, his dark hair neatly combed, his suit impeccable despite days of travel. He surveyed the dusty street with barely concealed disdain before his gaze landed on her. Recognition, followed by a calculated smile, crossed his features. "Abigail." He stepped toward her, ignoring Preston completely. "My dear wife, what a chase you've led me on." Abigail felt rather than saw Preston tense beside her, but she kept her focus on Charles. "I'm not your wife anymore, Charles. The divorce was finalized weeks ago." A flash of anger darkened his eyes before the pleasant mask slipped back into place. A misunderstanding, surely, one best discussed in private. He glanced dismissively at Preston. I'm sure your friend will excuse us. Mr. Sullivan is staying, Abigail said firmly. Anything you have to say can be said in front of him. Charles's smile tightened. Always so dramatic, Abigail. The doctors warned me about your nervous condition, how it might lead to irrational behavior. He raised his voice slightly, clearly intending to be overheard by the gathering onlookers. I've come to take you home, my dear, back to proper care and the comforts you're accustomed to. I am home, Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the familiar coldness spreading through her veins at his manipulative tactics. This is my property, left to me by my aunt. I have no intention of leaving. Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice. Don't be foolish. You know what happens when you defy me. These people can't protect you forever. Before Abigail could respond, Preston moved forward, placing himself partially between them. Mr. Blackwood, I believe the lady has made her position clear. She's not leaving with you. Charles assessed Preston with cold calculation. And who might you be to interfere in a family matter? Preston Sullivan, neighbor and friend to Mrs. Harrington. The emphasis on her maiden name was subtle but unmistakable. Well, Mr. Sullivan, I suggest you mind your own business. My wife is unwell, ex-wife, Abigail interrupted, finding strength in Preston's solid presence beside her. And I've never been healthier than I am now, away from you. Charles's facade cracked slightly, his tone hardening. Abigail, you're embarrassing yourself. These country simpletons may not understand our world, but you and I both know your place is in Boston with me. Her place, Preston said evenly, is wherever she chooses it to be. And she's chosen here. A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the confrontation. Mrs. Holloway, Reverend Graham, the Mitchells, Amy Wilkins, Mr. Sawyer and his son, and several others Abigail recognized from church and town visits. Their presence bolstered her courage. Charles, noting the audience, adjusted his approach. I understand you may have been confused, my dear. The strain of society obligations, perhaps, but it's time to come home now. Your friends miss you. Your charities need your attention. The only strain I suffered was living in fear of your temper, Abigail replied, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I've built a new life here, Charles. A better one. Fury flashed in his eyes, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think these backwater nobodies will accept you when they learn the truth? That you're a disobedient wife who ran from her responsibilities? That she's what? Preston interrupted, his tone dangerously soft. A woman who refused to be beaten. Who had the courage to escape a man who left marks like these. He gently took Abigail's arm, lifting it slightly to reveal the faded scars visible where her sleeve had pulled back. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Charles's expression darkened, but he recovered quickly. Unfortunate accidents, misinterpreted by a fragile mind. My wife has always been prone to, she tried to hide the marks on her arms, Preston continued, speaking now to the gathered townspeople rather than Charles. But the truth is, she's got nothing to be ashamed of. The shame belongs to the man who put them there. A shift occurred in the crowd, subtle but palpable. Expressions hardened as they looked at Charles, the outsider, the Easterner in his fine clothes who suddenly seemed less impressive and more sinister. Sheriff Jenkins stepped forward. Mr. Blackwood, I understand you've traveled a long way, but it seems the lady isn't interested in renewing your acquaintance. I suggest you take the next stage back east. This is absurd, Charles sputtered. She's my wife, ex-wife, several voices corrected in unison. I have rights, not here you don't, the sheriff interrupted. Not in my town. Charles looked from face to face, searching for an ally and finding none. His gaze returned to Abigail, cold fury replacing the calculated charm. You think you've won, that these peasants will protect you? I'll return with proper authorities, legal documents. I'll contest this divorce, claim this property. You'll do no such thing. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. I've documented Mrs. Harrington's injuries since her arrival. I have sworn statements about her condition. Any judge with a conscience would throw your case out immediately. And if legal means don't dissuade you, Preston added quietly, you should know that frontier justice has its own methods for men who hurt women. The threat, delivered in Preston's calm, matter-of-fact tone, seemed to finally penetrate Charles's arrogance. He looked around at the hard faces surrounding him, men who worked the land with their hands, who knew violence as a tool rather than a sport, and for the first time, Abigail saw fear in his eyes. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Abigail replied, a lifetime of suppressed defiance rising to the surface. "Go home, Charles. There's nothing for you here." For a moment he seemed ready to argue further, but Sheriff Jenkins moved closer, one hand resting meaningfully on the gun at his hip. With a final glare at Abigail, Charles turned and stalked into the hotel, his rigid back a testament to his fury. The tension broke as he disappeared, and suddenly, Abigail found herself surrounded by supportive voices. Mrs. Holloway patting her hand, Reverend Graham offering quiet words of encouragement, Amy squeezing her arm in solidarity. The community had witnessed her most vulnerable moment and responded not with judgment but with protection. Throughout it all, Preston remained at her side, a steady presence as the crowd gradually dispersed. Sheriff Jenkins promised to ensure Charles left on the next day's stage, and Dr. Mitchell offered to escort Abigail home. "If you don't mind," she said, "I prefer Mr. Sullivan's company." The doctor nodded understandingly, and soon Abigail found herself walking beside Preston toward where her buggy waited. They moved in silence, the events of the confrontation hanging between them. "Thank you," she finally said as they reached the buggy, "for standing with me. For saying what you did." Preston helped her onto the seat before responding. "I only spoke the truth. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Abigail, never did. I feel lighter somehow, as though a shadow I've been carrying has finally lifted." She looked down at him, still standing beside the buggy. "Will you come back with me? I don't think I want to be alone just yet." He nodded, mounting his horse, and they traveled together back to her cottage, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. Neither spoke during the journey, each lost in private thoughts as the landscape rolled past. At the cottage, Preston tended to the animals while Abigail prepared a simple meal. The domestic routine felt comforting after the tension of the day, and by the time they sat down to eat, a sense of normalcy had returned. "You think he'll really leave?" Abigail asked as they finished their food. "He doesn't have much choice. Sheriff Jenkins will see to it." Preston leaned back in his chair. Men like Blackwood rely on isolation, keeping their victims separated from support. Here, surrounded by people who care about you, his power is gone. "People who care about me," Abigail repeated softly, meeting his gaze across the table. "People like you." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I think we've established that I'm especially in that category. You never said why." The boldness of her question surprised even Abigail, but after facing Charles, smaller fears seemed insignificant. Preston considered her for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "At first, it was just being a decent neighbor. Then it was admiration for your courage, starting over in a place so different from everything you knew, and somewhere along the way." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Somewhere along the way, it became something more. The simple honesty of his answer touched Abigail deeply. "I've been afraid to name it," she admitted. "After Charles, I swore I'd never give anyone that kind of power over me again. Love shouldn't be about power." Preston's voice was gentle. "It should be about partnership, respect, growing together." "Is that what this is? Love?" The word felt both frightening and exhilarating on her tongue. "I can only speak for myself," he replied, his gaze steady. "But yes, Abigail, I believe I fell in love with you somewhere between teaching you to milk a cow and watching you stand up to the man who hurt you. I've been trying not to rush you, knowing what you've been through. But today, seeing your courage, I don't want to hide how I feel anymore." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. She had thought herself incapable of this feeling, had believed Charles had destroyed that part of her forever. Yet here it was, unfurling in her chest like a flower reaching for sunlight. "I don't know if I remember how to do this properly," she whispered. "How to love without fear." Preston reached across the table, his hand open in invitation but not demanding. "We can figure it out together, day by day. No rushing, no pressure." Abigail placed her hand in his, marveling at how different it felt from Charles's touch. Preston's hand was calloused from honest work, strong but gentle, offering support rather than restraint. "I'd like that," she said, and the smile that lit his face made her heart skip. They talked long into the evening, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams for their futures, discovering the common ground that existed beneath their different backgrounds. When Preston finally rose to leave, twilight had faded to full darkness. "Stay," Abigail said impulsively. At his raised eyebrow, she blushed. "Not, I meant, it's late and the couch is comfortable. I'd feel safer knowing you're here with Charles still in town." Preston nodded, understanding both what she was offering and what she wasn't. "I'll stay." In the morning, they rode together into town, arriving just as the eastbound stage was preparing to depart. Charles stood beside it, his luggage being loaded by the driver. He glared when he saw them but made no move to approach. Sheriff Jenkins stood nearby, one hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Just wanted to make sure he left," Preston explained as they watched from a distance. The stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, bearing Charles Blackwood back toward the world he understood, away from the woman who had defied him and the community that had protected her. Abigail watched until it disappeared from sight, a weight lifting from her shoulders with each turn of the wheels. "It's really over," she breathed. Preston's hand found hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "A new beginning," he corrected gently. As they turned away from the departing stage, Abigail noticed the curious glances and small smiles from townspeople who observed their clasped hands. Rather than embarrassment, she felt a quiet pride. Here, in this place so different from the rigid society she'd left behind, she could build a life based on truth rather than appearance, on genuine connection rather than social expectation. The months that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Abigail's cottage, once merely a refuge, became truly her home as she added personal touches: curtains sewn from fabric chosen at the general store, pressed wildflowers framed on the walls, books arranged by her preferences rather than for show. Preston was a constant presence, respectful of her need for independence while gradually becoming more integrated into her daily life. Their courtship progressed at a pace that felt comfortable to Abigail: evenings spent reading by the fire, Sunday dinners after church, long conversations as they worked together on projects around her property. Winter arrived with a ferocity that tested Abigail's frontier skills, but she found herself thriving in the challenge. The cottage, snug and well-provisioned thanks to her summer and fall work, became a haven against the snow and wind. On particularly harsh days, Preston would ride over to check on her, often staying to share a meal or help with difficult chores. It was during one such visit, as a January blizzard raged outside, that Preston finally spoke of a future together. They sat before the fireplace, mugs of hot coffee in hand, the storm's howl making the warmth of the cottage seem all the more precious. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice casual though his eyes were intent. My ranch house is bigger than this cottage with room for expansion. But I've always been fond of the view from your porch, especially at sunset. Abigail smiled, recognizing the deliberate indirection of his approach. Are you comparing real estate, Mr. Sullivan? In a manner of speaking. He set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. What I'm trying to say, not very elegantly, is that I love you, Abigail Harrington. I want to build a life with you, whether at my ranch, your cottage, or somewhere new altogether. I don't care about the where, as long as it's with you. The declaration, though expected after months of growing closeness, still brought tears to Abigail's eyes. You've never pressed me, never rushed me, even when I know you wanted more. You gave me time to heal, to find myself again. You were worth waiting for, he said simply. Abigail set her own mug aside and moved closer to him on the sofa. I love you too, Preston Sullivan. I think part of me has since that first day when you helped gather my scattered belongings and pretended not to notice the marks on my arms. I noticed, he admitted, taking her hands in his. It made me want to protect you. But then I got to know you, and I realized you didn't need protecting. You needed someone who would stand beside you while you protected yourself. That's exactly what you've done. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. And yes, I want to build a life with you too. His kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand, and Abigail answered with a certainty that surprised even herself. This was nothing like Charles's possessive embraces. Preston's touch held reverence, partnership, mutual desire. They were married in the spring, when wildflowers carpeted the hills around Sunrise Creek. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, the small church overflowing with well-wishers. Abigail wore a simple gown of pale blue, her arms bare for the first time in public. The faded marks a testament to her journey rather than a source of shame. You've got nothing to be ashamed of, Preston had told her again that morning when she'd hesitated over the short-sleeved dress. Those scars show your strength, not your weakness. As they spoke their vows before Reverend Graham, Abigail looked into Preston's eyes and saw not the future she'd once feared: subjugation, fear, pain, but the one she'd never dared to hope for: partnership, respect, joy. Their life together blended their separate properties into one working ranch, combining Preston's cattle operation with Abigail's smaller homestead. The cottage became a guest house, eventually housing Amy Wilkins and her children when the widow accepted a position as their housekeeper and assistant. 2 years after their wedding, Abigail gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Martha Sullivan, named for the aunt whose legacy had brought her to Montana, and the neighbor who had first welcomed her to Sunrise Creek. A son, James, followed 2 years later, his father's blue eyes and his mother's quiet determination evident from his earliest days. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were playing in the yard, Abigail and Preston often sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and purple. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her instead of the view, his expression filled with a contentment that matched her own. "Any regrets?" he asked once. About leaving Boston, that life. Abigail considered the question seriously, as was her way. "I regret the years wasted in fear. I regret believing I wasn't strong enough to leave sooner." She looked out over the land that had become her home, to the children who would grow up knowing only love in their parents' house, to the man who had taught her that strength and gentleness could exist in the same heart. "But no, I don't regret a single step that brought me here. This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Preston's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of deep love. "I'm grateful every day that you found your way to Sunrise Creek, Abigail Sullivan." "As am I," she replied, leaning against his shoulder as the last rays of sun gilded the distant mountains. "As am I."